Today, I'm delighted to be joined by one of Australia's most prominent economists, Mr. Saul Eslake. Saul has an impressive career spanning over 4 decades, during which he has served as chief economist at major institutions like ANZ and Bank of America Merrill Lynch. He's renowned for his ability to demystify complex economic concepts for everyday people, making this subject accessible and engaging for everyone. Currently, he leads his own consulting firm, Conina Economic Advisory, and contributes as a Vice Chancellor Fellow at the University of Tasmania. He's also been a trusted advisor to various government bodies and an active commentator on issues ranging from housing affordability to fiscal policy. So, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining me today.
Good afternoon, Akhil. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your program and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I came across your work when you were talking about the spirit of Tasmania and the fiasco which has been going around it. But before anything else, if you could tell all of us a bit about yourself, and also I would like to add to this question that why did you choose to return to Tasmania, which I believe was after 34 years?
Well, yeah, as you said in your introduction, I've been an economist for 45 years, which when I say that sounds like a very long time. I went to high school and university here in Tasmania. And to answer your last question, even though I spent about 35 years living on what we in Tasmania call the mainland of Australia, in Canberra initially and then mostly in Melbourne, I always thought that at some stage, before I became senile, I would return to my home state of Tasmania, partly for my own reasons, but also because I hoped that Tasmania would be part of my children's experience as it was for me, even if, as I did, they leave to pursue their careers either somewhere else in Australia or maybe even in another country. But I began my career, as a lot of economists in Australia did, at the Australian Treasury or Finance Ministry in Canberra. I was there for a little over 2 years. I didn't really like living in Canberra all that much, I have to admit, and so I came back to Tasmania, realised that that was a mistake from a career point of view, and went to Melbourne, which is, for those who don't know it, Australia's second biggest city. It might be Australia's most popular city again by sometime in the 2030s, given the rates at which Melbourne and Sydney have been growing over the past decade or so. And in Melbourne, I initially worked as an economic advisor to a politician in the state parliament, but shortly afterwards, about 18 months after I started that job, moved into the private sector, working initially as a junior economist for a more senior economist that I had known while I was working at the Federal Treasury in Canberra, and then subsequently became chief economist of a stockbroking firm in the second half of the 1980s, then chief economist international for the funds management arm of what at the time was Australia's second largest life insurance company. Then I had 14 years as chief economist of ANZ Bank, which you mentioned, which is one of Australia's big 4 commercial banks. I took a little break from that in 2009 and worked for a think tank affiliated with Melbourne University called the Grattan Institute, but was tempted back into the financial markets in 2011, where I worked for about 3.5 years as the Australian and New Zealand chief economist for Bank of America Merrill Lynch. But by 2015, I wanted to come back to Tasmania. There obviously aren't a lot of opportunities to work as an employee in a small place like Tasmania with a population of 570,000 people. But I was able to set up my own business, and that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years.
Very nice and a wonderfully elaborate career. And thank you for highlighting that. You have always sounded like a very passionate economist. I tried to go through as many lectures of yours as possible, but obviously there are quite a few. So if you would like to mention that, who has been your favorite economist, and or who inspired you to come into this subject, which sounds or looks like quite dry from the outside?
Well, it does often look dry to the outside. There's a joke that's sometimes told in Australia. I sometimes use that economists are people who are good with numbers but don't have the personality to be chartered accountants. And in fact, I came to economics in a rather roundabout or process of elimination way. For reasons that I can't really remember anymore. When I was thinking about what to do at university, as I was coming to the end of my senior secondary school, I didn't really want to do the things that students who'd done academically well were meant to want to do, like law or medicine. I didn't want to do anything that required me to go at the age of 17 to a different part of Australia in order to do that course at a university if it wasn't offered at the university here in Hobart. I had thought about doing history or geography because they were my favourite subjects at school, but my parents encouraged me to think about whether that would lead to any rewarding financially and in other ways career. So it sort of came down to a choice between engineering and commerce. And I didn't do engineering in part because you had to be really good at maths to be good at engineering. And although I'd passed math subjects in year 11 and 12, I hadn't done exceptionally well at them. So I did commerce, expecting that I'd become an accountant, and at least I and my father knew what an accountant did. In first year, you had to do some accounting subjects and you had to do some economic subjects, and I found the economic subjects much more interesting than the accounting ones, so I switched my major at the beginning of second year of my university course. At the end of third year, I got a scholarship, or cadetship as it was called, from the Federal Treasury, which paid for me to do fourth year and provided a job at the end of it, which allowed me to answer my father's question, what are you going to do with this degree? And as I say, it was a roundabout way to come to the subject, but I've since I heard the quote, have always been inspired by the words of James Tobin, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1980, and who said, in accepting that Nobel Prize, that he'd studied economics because it offered the hope, as it still does, of leading to the betterment of mankind. I likewise always drawn a degree of inspiration from Maynard Keynes's words in the final page of his most famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, where he said that the ideas of economists, good and bad, are more powerful than is generally recognized. And he said even the most practical of men who think themselves exempt from any intellectual influences are usually distilling the thoughts of some academic scribbler from years back. And it's interesting to reflect that Keynes wrote that in 1936. So those people who today argue that economists have too much influence might be ignorant of the fact that one of the greatest economists of the 20th century was saying that sort of thing almost 90 years ago. There are other economists apart from Keynes and Tobin whose work I've admired. They would include, at least while he was a practicing academic economist, Paul Krugman, who nowadays is probably better known for the columns he writes in the New York Times. I've been a great fan of economists like Jagdish Bhagwati, who's one of the pioneers of international trade theory, and of Amartya Sen, who is also a Nobel Prize winner and has been very important in talking about the economics of development and of the concept of well-being in an economic context. And there's a range of other economists in the private sector who are perhaps not well known among the academic community, including some for whom I've worked in the past, that I've always taken a great deal of encouragement and inspiration from.
That is truly inspiration for the betterment of mankind, and you really are an inspired personality. Now, myself, as an immigrant aspirant who has been trying to study Tasmania as much as I can before getting the final chance to relocate to this island state, I understand that Tasmania's economic performance and the overall structure is different from the rest of the Australia, which is called as mainland. Do you see there is a basic difference between the economic structure of Tasmania and the rest of Australia? And why, if there is any, why is there is difficult to change this trend?
Well, there are differences among all the Australian states and territories. For example, Western Australia is very much dominated by the mining sector, which I think from memory accounts for 33% of gross product. That puts Western Australia up with places like Norway and Saudi Arabia and Qatar in terms of their dependence on minerals and energy resources. The Northern Territory and to a lesser extent Queensland are also what we refer to as mining states. Whereas, for example, in New South Wales and Victoria, which are homes to Australia's two largest cities of Sydney and Melbourne, sectors such as financial services, professional and business services are very big contributors to their states' economies. And Tasmania has a relatively small population of 570,000. We're never going to have a big financial or professional and business services sector. And although 100 years ago, mining was an important part of the Tasmanian economy, in fact, mining 100 years ago accounted for a bigger share of Tasmania's economy than of Western Australia's. The simple fact is that much of Tasmania's known mineral reserves have been exploited, and the mining sector is now a relatively small part of Tasmania's economy. Agriculture is a big part of Tasmania's economy. It's almost 10% of gross product, compared with now for Australia as a whole, only about 2.5% of gross product. And agriculture is actually one of not many activities that Tasmania does conspicuously better than the rest of Australia, which is reflected in the fact that agricultural land is worth more per hectare in Tasmania than in most other parts of Australia. But as figures that were out on the day that we're recording this for the economic performance of Australia's states and territories in the 2023-24 financial year made clear, Tasmania is the poorest state in the country. Its gross product per capita is about 26,000 Australian dollars per head, or about 25% below the national average, and it's the lowest of every state and territory. And that's because a smaller proportion of Tasmanians work than any other state or territory. That is partly a function of Tasmania's population being older, so we have more people who are retired, but even so, in every age group, the proportion of Tasmanians who have jobs is smaller than in any other state or territory. Secondly, Tasmanians work on average 1.3 hours per week less than the national average. Now, that might not sound very much, but if you multiply it out over the course of a whole year, it's as if we had almost 10 more public holidays a year than people in other states and territories. Now, the reason for that is that a higher proportion of Tasmanian jobs are part-time jobs than in any other state or territory. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, for each hour that those Tasmanians who have a job work, they produce about 18% less by way of dollar value of goods and services than people who have jobs in other states and territories. Or to put it in economics language, labour productivity is conspicuously lower in Tasmania than anywhere else. And those three things, lower participation in employment, lower average hours worked, and lower productivity, explain all of the difference between Tasmania's per capita gross product and that of the rest of Australia. And I've long argued that one factor which is common to all three of those shortcomings is the poor performance of Tasmania's education system. Because the work of lots of economists over a long period of time shows that the more education you have, the more likely you are to get a job, the more likely that job is to be a full-time one rather than part-time, and the higher your productivity is likely to be, so that the more you will get paid. So I think it's a real problem that Tasmania has a smaller proportion of its adults who have a university degree, and a much higher proportion than any other state or territory of people who have left school at year 10 and have nothing beyond that. Tasmania's school education system differs from that of every other state in that the public high schools stop at year 10. And if students want to go on, as I wish they all would, to a full secondary education, that is completing year 12, they have to go to a separate college. And if you happen not to live in one of the 4 cities in Tasmania where a college is located, then that can entail a commute of up to 2 hours in each direction a day, or going away to board as a 15 or 16-year-old, which many young people are uncomfortable with. And so far fewer Tasmanians actually go to year 11 and 12 than in any other state, where the expectation is that you will finish year 12 where you start year 7 or year 8. In Tasmania, that doesn't happen. And so for more than 25 years, I've been advocating for significant changes to the structure of Tasmania's education system, unfortunately to little avail, but that is something that Tasmania could do on its own, which I think would make a significant improvement to the well-being of Tasmanians and to Tasmanian material living standards. Unfortunately, from this perspective, Tasmanians are largely insulated from the personal consequences for them of Tasmania's poor economic performance by the way the national income tax and social security systems work. So Tasmanians pay less in income tax than people in any other part of the country, and receive more by way of social security benefits than people in any other part of the country. And what that means is that although Tasmania's per capita gross product is, as I said before, some 25% below the national average, household disposable income is only about 8.5% below the national average. And so, as I say, Tasmanians are perhaps less receptive to the idea that fundamental reforms are needed to lift the economic performance of our state. In much the same way, what is known in Australia as horizontal fiscal equalisation among state governments, that is the distribution of money from the federal government, which collects most of the tax revenue in the Australian federal system, to state and territory governments, is done on a basis which seeks to allow each state and territory to provide similar levels of public services, whilst levying on their people similar levels of state taxation. As a practical matter, that means that Tasmania gets more than twice as big a share of federal grant to the states, or nowadays revenue from Australia's goods and services tax, than it would if that revenue was distributed on an equal per capita basis, as some of the bigger states have long argued that it should be. And to some extent, that insulates the state government from the consequences of Tasmania's poor economic performance and allows it to spend relatively more on public services and infrastructure whilst collecting relatively less from the people in state taxes. So it's actually been very difficult, I've found, over the course of more than 25 years of advocating for economic reform in Tasmania. It's actually difficult to build political support for reforms that are more easily or readily taken up in other richer parts of the country. And it's difficult to persuade state governments that they could and should do things that would improve Tasmania's economic performance and result in better material and, I would say, non-material standards of living for the people of Tasmania.
Well, Tasmania sounds like that need to do a lot more catching up as compared to the rest of the states. Your report also emphasizes that the deterioration of Tasmania's finances is mainly attributed to the government policies. Would you like to highlight any of the specific example of any such policy which has led towards that decline? Because I believe until some time ago, Tasmania was one of the better states in terms of the economic performance as compared to the rest of them.
Well, Tasmania has never been a leader in economic performance, since the set of figures we now use to assess these things commenced in 1989-90. Tasmania's per capita gross product has always been at least 18%, and more recently about 25% below the average of all states and territories. So it's actually got worse over the last 30 years, and some of that is attributable to the aging of Tasmania's population at a faster rate than the rest of the country. But that's a circular argument, because one of the reasons why Tasmania's population is aging more rapidly than the rest of Australia is that talented young people perceive accurately, in most cases, that they can have better opportunities by moving to other parts of the country. Now, that's not unusual for islands. The same thing happens, for example, in Newfoundland in Canada and
Yeah.
to residents of the Outer Hebrides and the Shetland Islands and the Orkneys in Scotland, and to people in Sardinia and Sicily in Italy, and to Hokkaido in Japan. It's a common feature of small islands adjacent to much larger land masses. But as I say, there are things that Tasmania could, and I've argued should do, that would perhaps lessen that, so that more talented Tasmanians could see a future for themselves here, and maybe talented people from other parts of Australia and other parts of the world, maybe like you, I feel, would see an opportunity to make a future for themselves and for their families here in Tasmania. And I hope more people will do that.
Sure, thank you very much. Hopefully, it will be a good sign as well. And you also argued about that there should be a shift from the regular stamp duty towards the land tax. Do you see there would be an effect on the housing affordability in terms of the people who will be able to afford a land or a house, as compared to if they will be continuing living in that house? How do you see that could have an adverse impact on that?
Well, Akhil, two of my long-term passions have been housing and tax reform. And when you mention stamp duty and land tax, that's at the intersection of those two issues. So there are arguments for replacing the system of stamp duties, which all Australian states and territories impose on transactions in property, with a more broadly based land tax that in particular includes owner-occupied property, the so-called family home. And the tax reform arguments for that are partly a matter of efficiency. That is to say that stamp duty acts as a disincentive to the most efficient uses of land. It, for example, is a major barrier to older people downsizing to more appropriate accommodation as they get older and as their children have left home and they no longer need such big houses. But having to pay a big tax on any transaction you undertake at that stage of your life is a barrier to the more efficient use of property. And it's one reason why we've got a growing number of empty bedrooms across Australia that could be more efficiently utilised at a time when we have nationally a housing crisis. There is also an argument that the revenue from stamp duty is inherently unpredictable and volatile, because it depends not only on property prices, but also on the volume of transactions, which is very difficult to predict. Whereas land tax is one of the most predictable forms of revenue raising a government can have. I mean, if you know the value of land and you set a tax rate, you know how much revenue you're going to get. And so it makes for more stable management of state finance. But thirdly, there's an equity argument. And that is that there's something fundamentally unfair about a system of property taxation that expects people who, for whatever reason, move home 3 or 4 times in their life, because they have to move for a different job, or because their family circumstances change, or for some other reason, they have to contribute more to the cost of providing schools, hospitals, policing, child protection, environmental protection, public transport and the like, than someone who buys a house and lives in it for the next 50 years. There's something fundamentally unfair about that. Whereas replacing stamp duties with a more broadly based land tax would, I think, not only result in a more efficient and equitable system of property taxation, but I think it would also help improve housing affordability for 2 reasons. One, stamp duty is a very significant additional burden that first home buyers in particular have to meet, that makes it harder for them. Even though state governments often offer exemptions, partial or full, from stamp duty, it's an additional burden that they have to contemplate. But second, because economic theory tells us that if people know that they're going to have to pay an annual land tax for as long as they own a piece of land, they will take that into account in determining how much they're prepared to pay for that land. And so imposing a land tax on all occupied property would, I think, reduce land values relative to what they otherwise might be. And that would be a very fundamental contribution and a lasting contribution to improving home ownership. So from both a tax reform perspective and from an improving housing affordability perspective, I think stamp duty for land tax, or the other way around, land tax for stamp duty, makes a lot of sense. It's politically challenging, of course, because stamp duty only imposes a lot of tax, but on a relatively small number of people each year at a few times in their lives. And asking politicians to replace that with a land tax that everyone who owns land has to pay every year is what Sir Humphrey Appleby in the British Yes Prime Minister program would have called courageous. That is to say, it would risk costing a lot of votes.
I admire the way you very easily explain the things, and hopefully it will have some good sign the way the government is trying to do the things. Do you see there are any more critical steps other than this to stabilize its finances in Tasmania?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, my advocacy of reform of property tax is really for the reasons I just gave, that is improving the equity and efficiency of the state tax system and doing something to help housing affordability rather than it being a measure to put Tasmania's finances on a more sustainable footing, although you could structure a reform in a way that made a net positive contribution to revenue. But no, rather, and this goes back to a question you asked before, why Tasmania is in the financial difficulties that it now is, which by some metrics are more serious than any other state in Australia, including Victoria, which is more widely recognised as becoming a financial basket case. In the middle of the past decade, around 2015, 2016, Tasmania was running cash surpluses. The state government was running cash surpluses, and it was actually a net creditor. That is to say, it had more money in the bank than it owed by way of conventional government bonds. But beginning in 2018, the government embarked on what you would have to call a spending spree. Now, some of that in 2020 through 2022 was unavoidable as a result of the COVID pandemic and the things that all governments, not just Tasmania, but all governments had to do in order to keep people safe and prevent hardship arising from the measures that governments instituted to stop the spread of the pandemic. And I understand that. But the problem really is that at 3 consecutive elections, the party which has formed government since 2014 has undertaken to spend and delivered on its undertakings, spending in excess of 1.8 billion a year on 3 separate occasions. So we're talking about a fairly significant increase in spending without saying a word about how it would be paid for. So we've gone from running cash surpluses and being a net creditor to now running, if you include the government business enterprises, which account for a bigger share of Tasmania's economy than the economies of most other states and territories, running the biggest cash deficits of any jurisdiction in the country and heading towards having the biggest net financial liabilities, that's debt plus the very large in Tasmania liability which the government has to pay pensions to future generations of retired public servants, which haven't been fully funded by employer contributions, the worst in Australia. And when you find yourself in that position, there are really only 4 things you can do. One is to cut spending on the delivery of services. 2 is to cut infrastructure spending. 3 is to raise additional revenue through taxes and charges or other forms. And 4 is to sell off government assets through what's often known as privatisation. I mean, there aren't any other options, although there are lots of things that fall under each of those headings. I argued in the report I did for the Tasmanian Parliament, pursuant to the agreement between the Premier and a minority party after the election held in March this year, that cutting spending on services to Tasmanians shouldn't be the main route to getting back to financial stability, because figures that I quoted in my report from the Commonwealth Grants Commission, whose calculations are the basis for Tasmania's above average share of GST revenue, show that Tasmania is spending about 750 million a year less than the Grants Commission assesses it needs to provide the same level of services to Tasmanians as the average of all states and territories. And so cutting spending as the main means of putting Tasmania on a path back to fiscal sustainability would, I think, unnecessarily hurt the most vulnerable Tasmanians who depend on those services. On the other hand, I think there is scope for scaling back infrastructure spending, because Tasmania is planning to run the biggest infrastructure spending program in the country as a proportion of our gross state product, and we simply can't afford to do that. I said that there was scope to raise additional revenues because the Grants Commission's assessments show that Tasmania is raising about $150 to $200 million a year less than it would if its state tax regime were equivalent to the average of all other states and territories. And I pointed in my report to state treasury estimates showing that exemptions from payroll tax and land tax are each costing about $270 million per year in revenue forgone. So there are options to raise additional revenue, for example, by not having the highest payroll tax threshold of any state, as we do in Tasmania, or that we could raise more revenue from mineral royalties, or that we don't need to have the lowest fees for registering and purchasing motor vehicles of any state except South Australia. So there are certainly options that could be pursued. Unfortunately, to date, the government doesn't seem to have had any appetite for taking them up.
Okay, just one question from the viewpoint of a common Tasmanian or a person who is able to save about, let's say, $20,000, $30,000 at the end of a year. Where should he invest, he or she?
Well, Akhil, I have to say to you, I don't give investment advice to individuals. I'm not licensed to do that, and so it would actually be against the law for me to give investment advice. I mean, I would say to most people in general terms that if you can afford to save up the deposit for a house, then that's something that's usually worth doing because of the security it gives you, especially if you're planning to have or already have a family. A secure place, a secure environment into which you can bring up your children. It gives you a stake in your community that is harder to achieve if you're renting, although it's not impossible if you're renting. But importantly, it's also a very important source of security in retirement. Traditionally in Australia, the majority of people who reach retirement age own their own homes outright, and so they have very low housing costs, and that allows older people to survive if they're dependent on the pension on what's not a very high income. That's becoming increasingly difficult for a growing proportion of Australians now because an increasing proportion of people under the age of 45 aren't able to buy a house, or if they do, they buy with a much bigger mortgage that they probably won't have paid off by the time they reach retirement age, and quite rationally from their perspective use some or all of their superannuation to pay off their remaining mortgage, and then they'll be dependent on the age pension. So if you can afford to save up the deposit for a house, if you can tap into what's now known as the bank of mum and dad, get your parents to lend you money to purchase a house, not everyone can do that, of course, then that's certainly well worth considering. If you have scope to put additional money into superannuation over and above what the law obliges your employer to do, then that's also something that's likely to make you considerably better off in retirement. Even my kids know that Albert Einstein said, among many other things, that compound interest is the most powerful force in nature. And it is. Saving an additional $1,000 a year in superannuation in your 20s makes an enormous difference to what you have to retire on when you're 65 or 70. Beyond that, if you have funds to dabble in the share market, then I would say either do a lot of research yourself, and remember that what matters is not simply buying good companies and avoiding bad ones, but buying good companies at the right price. And being prepared to sell good companies at the right price if too many people agree with you that it's a good company. To be honest with you, Akhil, that's something I always found very difficult to do. And so the best financial decision I ever made, and I'm saying this sincerely, is to hand over the management of my investments to people who were much better at it than I am. And I've never regretted doing it.
Well taken. Yeah. Just before I let you go, I would like to know, you follow any sports in your life, or do you have a sports?
Well, I've never been an active participant in sports. I am absolutely incapable of figuring out where a ball is and putting a stick next to it, whether the ball is moving, as in hockey, or stationary as in golf, and I don't really have the physique or the stamina to play some of the other sports that young men in particular in this country often do. I mean, I like cricket. I love watching cricket. I like Australian rules football. I don't understand the versions of football they play in New South Wales and Queensland, various forms of rugby. I think too little happens in what the rest of the world calls football and we call soccer here in Australia. My son is a devoted tennis fan. I struggle with finding that interesting, but it's mainly football and cricket.
Very nice. Okay, so I thank you very much for your time. I believe that you have been traveling a lot and your flights have been delayed a lot. So I wish you timely departures for the days to come.
Well, thank you. Fortunately, I don't have any flights until next Monday. The last flight I took yesterday was on time, which was only the second out of the 8 that I've taken in the past 2 weeks that were on time. I hope things get better from here on.
Hopefully. Thank you very much for your stamina, your time, and your thoughts. They were really passionate, and I look forward to hear a lot about you from you in your next podcast and a lot of interviews. Thank you very much, Saul.
It's a pleasure, Akil. It's been nice talking to you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.